Hello students, it's Mr. Panza just going over this decimal test review sheet with you. I just want to remind you on how to solve these types of problems, then I'm going to let you handle the rest. The first thing I want you to remind you of is when you are changing fractions to decimals, you should be creating a place value chart. So go ahead and create the chart that I'm going to pop up on the board right now. Here it comes. Now that you see the chart, I would pause the video and copy this exact chart that you see. If you want to give yourself some more hints, one thing that we've done is represent the tenths with a 10 then a th so that we remember that all decimals have to be a tenth or a 100, which would be represented with 1 and 2 zeros and then a th. But otherwise, pause the video now and copy this chart. If you're done copying the chart, you can use this chart to help solve these problems, because now we know, for example, on question number 1, 5/10, well, that 5 then needs to go into the tenths category, and then I fill the holes with zeros. Whatever you put in this chart, I put on this line. The same thing goes for questions 2, 3, and 4. You just place the numerator into your chart and then copy your answer on these lines. When you're done with those first 4, continue to use the chart even for a mixed number. Keep in mind that a mixed number has a whole number and a fraction, and the whole number goes on this side of the decimal. This is where my 1s and 10s go. So the 3 would be in the 1s, which is when you write the decimal after a number, and then there is also another 3 in the tenths place value. So copy that to the chart, and then place your answer on question number 5. I should see a chart that looks just like this when I come back and check your work. If not, then I know you're not following directions. Then you can go down to the very next problems. Now I'm changing decimals into fractions. Use this chart again. I would actually draw the chart one more time. That reminds me that over here on the left is my whole number, and here on the right are my decimals. So for number 6, there is no whole number, which means it's just 0.32, which you already see is written right here as 0.32. And as a fraction then, I have 0 as a whole number, and 32 is my numerator. And to determine the denominator, just take a look at where your furthest digit ends up. In other words, which place value does this digit end up in? This 2 is in the hundredths. That means my denominator should surely be a certain number. Now, for the case of question number 8, that's a little bit different, because in that example, you actually do have a whole number. 5 is in the 1s, and then the 4 is in the hundredths. Make sure that you fill the tenths with a 0, and then rewrite it as a fraction. 5 is my whole number. What would be my numerator, and what would be my denominator? Remember, for fractions, the decimals must be tenth or hundredths. Go ahead and make sure that you have this chart copied down and answer questions 6 through 10. Then move on to questions 11 through 13. For questions 11, 12, and 13, you are either subtracting or adding. For 11 and 13, you subtract, and for 12, you add. I would again set up a place value chart, because then it makes it easy to line up your decimals and fill in the holes. So you must rewrite this problem vertically. Put your 3 in the 10s, 5 in the 1s for 35, and a 7 in the tenths as well as in the hundredths. 35 and 77 hundredths is on top because it's the first number I see. On the bottom, 25 and 43 hundredths. Now I just place my operation, which is to subtract, and I follow the process and circle my answer down here. 7 minus 3, 7 minus 4, 5 minus 5, 3 minus 2. For each of these problems, you should line up your decimals, fill in the holes in your place value chart to make sure that you're adding and subtracting as accurately as you possibly can. Then jump down to questions 14 through 17. All you have to do here is write these words in either standard or decimal form. So in this case, I have a written word form number, and we know the strategy for that. say this number out loud, write exactly what I say. So if I say 64 and 900ths, I know that the 64 should go first. When I use the word and, that's my decimal point, and I need to remember where would the 9 go, in the tenths or the hundredths. And if it goes into a certain place that needs to have a hole filled, make sure you fill it with a 0. I'll give you this one. The 9 goes in the hundredths place value, but I have to fill the tenths with a 0. I do the same thing for 15, and then for 16 and 17, they've given it to me in standard form. I need to say this number out loud, 5 and 6/10ths, and write exactly what I say, which would be a word form just like you've seen in 14 and 15. Once you've finished the entire front page, flip to the back. Expanded form for 18 and 19 is a little bit more tricky. Really, all you're doing is telling me what each of these digits is worth. Well, a 6 in the ones is going to be nothing more than 6. And expanded form tells me that I'm adding all of these. So I'm going to then add it, and because it's a decimal, I'm placing it in decimal or fraction form. So I'd have a point and a 1 in the tenths place value, plus a point, a 0 in the tenths, and a 3 in the hundredths. And that's because 6 in the ones plus 1/10 plus 3/100ths would be equivalent in standard form to 6 and 13/100ths. You do the same thing for question number 19, except you have 2 and 87/100ths. Now in 20 and 21, they are asking you specifically, how much is this 7 worth? How much is this 5 worth? I know you should know the answer to question 21, but you may not know the answer to question 20. That's because we've only talked about the tenths and hundredths. Well, we know that the decimal place value song starts with and, which is the decimal point, then the tenths, then the hundredths, followed by thousandths, and that's what you need to remember. This 7 is worth the thousandths because it's in the thousandths place value. So for this one, you can just copy down the answer, which fill those other two place values with zeros, and place a 7 in the thousandths place value. You should be able to determine how much the 5 is worth based on this example. Once you finish these 4, slide down to question 22. This is the decimal on the number line question. Now, I want to remind you of the steps to solve a decimal on a number line. Here they are. Step 1, I've got to determine where the whole number is. Step 2, count all of the spaces from the first whole number, in this case which would be 1, all the way to the last whole number. And then step 3, count the sticks. And I kind of flip-flop these because the spaces actually would be the denominator. So let me change that up. And the sticks would be my numerator. So let's start with step 1. The whole number is going to be 1, and that's because my dot is placed in between the 1 and 2. Once you've identified that this is a whole number 1 and this is a whole number 2, you should be able to see that my whole number must be 1, because if it were 2, the dot would be somewhere to the right of the whole number 2. Instead, place your whole number 1, not only as a fraction, but also as a decimal. Now, you'll also know as a decimal there's going to be a decimal point, and for a fraction we know this is a whole number, so we can circle it. Now go to step 2. Count the spaces to figure out what the denominator is going to be as a fraction. Spaces, I'll show you in red, are starting at the whole number 1 in between each stick. There's 1 space, 2 spaces, 3 spaces, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So the denominator is going to be 10. Now with decimals, it has to be 10 or 100. So if it isn't 10, you'd have to convert it to either a tenth or a 100th. But because it's 10, you're good to go. On to step 3, which is counting the sticks after the whole number to the decimal point. And I'll mark those in blue. Stick 1, stick 2, stick 3. That becomes your numerator. So in this case, my fraction is 1 3/10. Now my decimal, you need to take this fraction and convert it to decimal form. That's how you solve for fractions and decimals on number lines. Really the only difference with decimals is the fact that it must be a denominator of 10 or 100. Then slide down to your word problems, 23 and 24. 23, Abby runs 2.4 miles in a race. Sam ran 3.9 miles in the same race. How much further did Sam run? Well, if I'm using my K, W, S chart, I know that Abby, which I'll represent with an A and a bar model, ran a certain amount, in this case 2.4. And Sam, I'll represent with an S, who ran significantly more, ran 3.9. But what do we want to know? Our W is how much further Sam ran than Abby. Well, because it's how much further, and I see based on my bar, really this is what I'm looking for. How much is this? It's not 3.9, but it's going to be 3.9 minus the 2.4 to figure out this little space. That's the equation I can use in my S for solve. 3.9 minus 2.4. And that will get you the difference. And when we're talking about difference, that shows you the answer to this question. Please make sure that you mark your answer with a label. It's a certain number of miles. You can do the same thing for question 24. What do I know? I know that Owen's house is 78 hundredths of a mile from school. Here's his school. It's not a full mile, it's 78 hundredths of a mile. How far does he walk each day to and from school? Well, if I know that Owen walks to school every day, here's Owen. Not a great picture. We know that, well, one way he walks 78 hundredths of a mile, and then he also walks home 78 hundredths of a mile. Well, that's really nothing more than saying what? If I am trying to figure out how much he walks each day, that's what we want to know. Our question is how far does he walk each day? Well, to solve it, my equation could be one of two things. I could either do 78 times 2 or 78 plus 78. The only thing you have to keep in mind here is that your answer must have the decimal point, and it most likely, in this case, will be a mixed number. Now that you've had an opportunity to see how to solve these problems, go back, finish this worksheet, and see how you did in class when we return. Thanks.